The GPS died just as the dirt road narrowed into little more than 2 tyre ruts through the pine forest. 1 second, the screen glowed confidently with its blue trail and destination pin. The next, it froze, blinked, and went black. I remember the silence that followed, not just from the machine, but from us. The only sound left was the tick of cooling metal from the car's hood and the faint rush of wind through dry needles. It was late afternoon, and we were a good 20 miles from the nearest town, maybe more. My wife, Emma, leaned forward, tapping the screen as if a little insistence might bring it back to life. When it didn't, she looked at me with that half smile of disbelief that says, of course this would happen to us. We were somewhere deep in the Bitterroot wilderness of Montana. The plan had been a simple weekend escape. Drive out to a remote campground we'd read about online, spend 2 nights by the river, and head back before work on Monday. But the road had kept branching, and our trusty GPS had guided us deeper, promising shortcuts that never quite seemed to end. Now, with the sun sliding low and no service bars on either of our phones, it was just us, a dusty Subaru, and an expanse of forest we couldn't name. I popped open the glove box and pulled out an old road atlas I'd kept since college, more out of nostalgia than practicality. The creases were soft from years of folding, the edges stained with coffee and rain. "Guess we're going old school," I said, spreading it over the dashboard. Emma squinted at the fine print, tracing her finger along faded county lines. "You sure this covers this area?" she asked. "Close enough," I replied, though I wasn't sure at all. It was comforting just to have something to hold, something that didn't run on batteries. Outside, the air had that crisp alpine chill that comes when the day's heat starts to bleed off. The smell of pine resin hung thick, sweet and sharp. And somewhere off to the west, a raven croaked its lonely call. I stepped out to stretch and took a slow look around. Endless trees, a thread of sky, and a dirt road fading into the wilderness. For the first time in a long while, I felt what real isolation meant. No notifications, no hum of traffic, just the vastness of the land itself. Emma joined me, wrapping her jacket tighter. "Well," she said, "what now?" I looked down the road we'd been following, then back the way we came. Both directions looked equally lost. I smiled, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We find north," I said, "and we make our own map." She gave me a look somewhere between amusement and challenge, then went to the trunk. Out came the camping gear. Stove, food, our old compass. The same one my father had given me when I was 12 and learning to navigate the backcountry. I hadn't used it in years, but when I held it up and watched the red needle settle to north, something familiar stirred inside me. A quiet certainty, like remembering a language I hadn't spoken in a long while. We decided to make camp before dark. The forest around us had that hushed, watchful quiet that settles just before nightfall. The temperature dropped fast and the last sunlight turned the pine trunks a deep, glowing amber. Emma gathered kindling while I cleared a patch of ground near a fallen log. Soon, the first sparks caught, and the smell of wood smoke curled into the air, mixing with the damp scent of moss and earth. It wasn't the campsite we'd planned on, but as the fire grew steady and the stars began to show through the canopy, it felt like our own small outpost in a vast, wild world. Over dinner, a simple pot of soup heated on the camp stove, we studied the map and compass like 2 explorers from another century. "If this creek here," Emma pointed, "is the one we crossed earlier, then this road must loop east toward the river." She looked up at me, brow furrowed. "Assuming we're even on this page," I grinned. "Confidence, navigator. You've got this." She rolled her eyes, but smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The firelight flickered across her face, and for a moment, the situation didn't seem so bad. Just the 2 of us, figuring things out the way people used to, long before glowing screens told them where to turn. The night deepened. Somewhere out in the darkness, an owl hooted, slow and low. The flames popped, sending sparks into the air like fireflies. I lay back, tracing constellations I only half remembered. "You know," I said, "my dad used to tell me you can always find north by the stars if you look hard enough." Emma leaned against me, her voice soft. "Let's hope the compass is faster." We laughed quietly, the sound small against the wide silence of the forest. Sleep came easy, the kind that only comes after long miles and fresh air. But I woke once, just before dawn. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and a thin fog hung between the trees. In that bluish half-light, I could hear the creek murmuring somewhere to the south. A small sound, but enough to guide us when morning came. It reminded me of something my father used to say: "Water always leads somewhere, follow it, and you'll never stay lost forever." When the sun finally crept over the ridge, we broke camp. The air was cool, the sky perfectly clear, and the road ahead looked both inviting and uncertain. We packed the car, and I spread the map across the hood once more. The compass needle trembled, then steadied. North. "All right," I said, tapping the map. "If we follow the creek north for a few miles, we should hit the main trail that runs to the river. From there, civilization." Emma looked at me with that spark of confidence that only shows up when you've already decided to trust. "Let's do it," she said. As the engine started and the forest echoed with the sound of tyres crunching gravel, I couldn't help but smile. The GPS might have failed us, but something older, quieter, steadier had taken its place. We weren't just finding our way through the wilderness anymore. We were remembering how to find our way, period. By midday, the sun was high and the air had taken on that dry, resinous heat that seeps through the pines and hums with insects. We'd followed the creek north just as planned, crossing it twice where the road forded the shallow bends. It felt good to have direction again, though neither of us could say for certain we were where we thought we were. The map lines didn't quite match the folds of the land. The creek twisted differently. The ridges rose higher than expected. "I think this might be the wrong tributary," Emma said, tracing her finger along the blue threads on the page. "Could be," I admitted, glancing around at the terrain, "but the compass still says north. North has to lead somewhere." We parked near a clearing to stretch our legs and refill our bottles. The sound of running water was close, and a narrow animal trail led down to the creek. The water was cold, clear as glass, sliding over stones flecked with mica that glittered in the sun. Kneeling there, I caught sight of a set of deer tracks pressed into the mud, clean and recent. It struck me that the animals knew this land far better than any device or map could. They moved through it by instinct, by trust. I envied that, a little. When we climbed back to the car, clouds were building on the horizon, the kind that start soft and white, but gather purpose by afternoon. The light dimmed slightly, and I felt a familiar prickle of worry. "If that turns into rain," I said, "we'd better not be on this road when it hits." Emma nodded, scanning the sky. "Then we find shelter first and directions later." It was the kind of calm, matter-of-fact thinking that always steadied me. She had that way about her, even when everything else was uncertain. Not long after, the road split again. One fork climbed into a ridge of red rock, the other sank into darker woods. The compass showed both tracks veering north. I studied the shadows, the slope, the smell of the air, subtle signs that told you what kind of land you were walking into. The ridge meant exposure if the storm came, the woods meant mud and slower travel. Neither was ideal. "What's your gut say?" I asked. Emma closed her eyes for a second, breathed deep, then pointed to the woods. "Shelter," she said. "We can climb later if we have to." So we went that way, under the shadow of the pines, where the world grew dim and green. The first drops of rain found us not an hour later, soft at first, then steady, whispering on the leaves like 1,000 tiny footsteps. We pulled off to the side of the track and strung a tarp between two trees, setting our gear beneath. The scent of wet earth rose thick and alive. For a long while, we just sat, listening to the storm build, thunder echoing far off down the valley. There was something oddly comforting in it, a reminder that we were small, but still part of everything that moved and breathed out here. As the rain tapered off and the sky opened again to pale afternoon light, I caught Emma watching the compass in her hand. The needle danced, settled, then trembled again as if unsure. "Funny thing," she said quietly, "how it never points exactly where you expect it to. Just close enough to keep you moving." I smiled, realizing she wasn't just talking about the compass. We packed up as the forest dripped and glistened around us, each droplet falling like the beat of time itself. The road was slick, the mud clinging to our boots, but the air smelled fresh and new. We didn't know where the next turn would lead, but for the first time since the GPS died, it didn't feel like being lost. It felt like beginning. The next morning broke clear and sharp. The air washed clean from the storm. A heavy mist clung to the low ground, curling between the trees like breath from the earth itself. We set out early, wanting to make as much progress as we could before the sun grew hot. The forest seemed endless. Every rise revealed another, each valley leading to more of the same quiet wilderness. Still, the compass stayed true, its red needle pointing steadily north, and that small certainty was enough to keep our spirits up. By midday, though, the road simply ended. No gradual fade, no narrowing track, just stopped, swallowed by a tangle of brush and fallen timber. We stood there, silent, the buzzing of cicadas loud in the still air. "It can't just end," Emma said, scanning the thicket. "Maybe a landslide, or maybe the map's too old," I offered. She knelt to study the ground, running her fingers along a faint depression in the dirt. "There's a trail here," she said. "Faint, but it keeps going." I looked where she pointed, and sure enough, a barely visible footpath led between the trees, winding toward higher ground. We packed what we needed, water, snacks, compass, and the map, and decided to hike it on foot. The car, for the moment, would have to stay. The forest changed as we climbed. Pines gave way to fir and aspen, their leaves trembling in the light breeze. Somewhere below, we could hear the creek again, that constant companion murmuring through the valley. The climb grew steeper, the path less certain, until finally the trail thinned into nothing but forest floor. We stopped to catch our breath, sweat cooling on our necks. Emma pulled out the compass. "Still north," she said, her voice steady. "Then north it is," I replied, even though I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my gut. A little while later, we reached a small clearing, and that's when we noticed it. The silence. No wind, no birds, just a deep, still hush that seemed to press against our ears. Emma turned, slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Feels different here," she whispered. I nodded. The forest had that heavy stillness that sometimes comes before weather or before something wild moves nearby. I felt the old instincts stirring, the kind you don't think you have until you're far from safety. Then came the sound, faint, deliberate, the crunch of something stepping on damp leaves. I motioned for Emma to stay still. Another step, and another. A shadow flickered between the trees, a deer, head low, moving cautiously through the brush. We both exhaled, the tension easing out like air from a balloon. The deer froze for a moment, watching us, then bounded away with a flash of white tail. I laughed softly, my heart still racing. Guess we're not the only ones lost out here. Emma smiled, shaking her head. At least he knew which way was home. We hiked until the sun dipped low again, painting the sky in ribbons of gold and rose. From a rocky outcrop we finally saw it, the wide glint of water in the distance, winding like silver through the valley. The river. Relief flooded through me. We'd found our marker at last. "There it is," I said, arm around her shoulders. "You did it." She smiled faintly. We did it. Together. The light faded as we made our way downhill, the forest returning to its deep, rhythmic quiet. By the time we reached the valley floor, the sky had gone indigo. We made camp near the water, our fire reflecting off its rippled surface. The compass lay on the map between us, its needle steady now, as if content. "Funny," Emma said, her eyes on the flames. I thought losing that GPS was the worst thing that could have happened. Turns out, it might have been the best. I nodded slowly, watching the sparks rise into the dark. Yeah, I said. Sometimes you've got to lose your way a little to remember what it means to find it. The river led us back to the world. It took another day of slow hiking along its banks, our boots crunching over gravel and reeds, but by mid-afternoon, the trees thinned and the sound of the current grew wide and strong. Then, around a bend, we saw it. A narrow bridge of weathered boards, a hand-painted sign nailed to a post beside it. Forest Service Road 18, civilization, as simple and humble as that. Emma let out a long breath and dropped her pack in the grass. I never thought I'd be so happy to see a sign, she said. I laughed, stretching my sore shoulders. I never thought I'd trust a compass more than a satellite. We followed the road until a pickup truck appeared in the distance, a dust trail rising behind it. The driver was an older man in a ranger's hat, the kind of fellow who looked born to these woods. He slowed when he saw us, leaning out the window with a knowing grin. "You two look like you've had yourselves a time," he said. I explained how our GPS had died, somewhere back on an unmarked spur. He chuckled, nodding. "That happens out here more often than you'd think. These mountains don't much care for gadgets. You did right though. Map, compass, and keeping your wits. That's how folks used to do it, and it still works just fine." He gave us a lift to where our car still sat waiting, coated in a thin film of dried mud and pine needles. It felt strange, almost sentimental to see it again. Like greeting an old friend who'd patiently waited while we went off and learned a few lessons. We loaded our packs, thanked the ranger and drove slowly back down the winding road, this time letting the map rest open across Emma's knees. The late afternoon light slanted through the trees, gilding everything it touched. The branches, the dust, even the hood of the car. The GPS sat on the dashboard, dark and silent, but I didn't bother turning it on. We didn't need it anymore. Every bend of the road, every shadow and ridge felt familiar now. We'd earned our bearings the hard way. That evening, we stopped by a lakeshore to watch the sun go down. The water mirrored the clouds in soft streaks of orange and violet, and the first stars began to prick through. Emma sat beside me, tracing idle circles in the sand. "You know," she said quietly, "I was scared that first night. Really scared. Not of being lost, exactly. More of not knowing what to do." She paused, looking up at the fading light. "But you never panicked. You just kept going." I smiled, shaking my head. "I was scared too. I just didn't want you to see it." The wind rippled across the lake, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "Maybe that's the point," I said. "You don't wait to stop being afraid before you move. You move anyway, and that's how you find the trail again." We sat there long after the sun slipped behind the ridge, the fire dying to embers beside us. The night was quiet, except for the soft lap of water and the whisper of wind through the trees. Out there, in that stillness, it didn't matter that we'd gotten lost. What mattered was that we'd found something steadier than any signal: trust, patience, and the reminder that the old ways still guide true when everything else goes dark. The compass lay between us, its needle steady and sure, pointing north into the night. And for the first time in days, I felt no need to follow it. We already knew where we were,